NTV Television Network presents The Other Day, Current Era 1970. Translation and voiceover by BMI Russian. Good evening. You're watching episode 10 of our series The Other Day, 1961 to 1991, Current Era. Events, people, and occurrences which defined a lifestyle. Things that we can't imagine ourselves without, let alone comprehend. Another year, another episode. Today we're covering 1970. The All-Union Census, 100 years since the day of Lenin's birth, Willy Brandt's Eastern policy, the Lunokhod, the sport lotto, 600 square meters, White Son of the Desert, Turtlenecks, and the Volga Gaz-24. Commenting we have screenwriter and actress Renata Litvinova, writer Anatoly Strelyany. In 1970, the Lenin Prize went to a ballet performance called Spartacus, which took place in the Bolshoi Theater with Yury Grigorovich curating the whole thing. Up until then, the brainchild of Aram Khachaturian had already been shown in the Bolshoi and Kirovsky theaters, but it was only after a third attempt that Spartacus became the most popular Soviet ballet. The leaping, flying Vladimir Vasilyev as Spartacus and the crafty, aristocratic Maris Liepa as Crassus. For the first time in ballet, a male dancer happened to be in the spotlight instead of a ballerina. Spartacus was a manly ballet. For the first time in ballet, good and evil were battling it out on even terms. Good Spartacus's and bad Crassus's choreography turned out to be comparable in terms of artistic expression and mastery. This was the first time ever in ballet when the performer playing the main antagonist achieved such fantastic success. Crassus would come to be known as Maris Liepa's best role, while Spartacus will come to be regarded as Yury Grigorovich's best performance. On January 15, 1970, for the fourth time in 20th century Russian history, a nationwide census is conducted. Before that, these took place in 1913, 1939, and 1959. The results of the All-Union Census showed that the country's population consisted of 247,010,000 people, placing us third after China and India. The entire country was involved in an All-Union Census. Over 500,000 counters assisted in implementing this vital state campaign. The census revealed the total population increase, which amounted to 15% over the span of 20 years. That's a 10% increase in Russia, 11% in Belarus, 12% in Ukraine, and over 40% in all of the Middle Asian republics and in Kazakhstan. 56% of people now lived in cities, with the average lifespan being 70 years, meaning that in general the country was aging. Apparently, we were in a state of demographic decline. On February 9, 1970, the Union of Soviet Writers' Board's Secretariat decides on rearrangements in Novyi Mir magazine's management. Out of 13 members of the editorial board, 7 were expelled. Valery Kosolapov replaced Alexander Twardovsky as editor-in-chief. This had to be the most severe repressive campaign in the realm of arts and ideology. In preparation for taking down the USSR's most liberal magazine, a letter on behalf of 11 writers was published in Ogonyok, titled "What is Novyi Mir speaking out against?" The editorial board was accused of defaming Soviet reality and of skeptical attitudes towards the moral values of Soviet society. Their colleagues from other magazines also hopped onto that bandwagon. Socialist Industry newspaper published a series of letters from workers who were upset with Novyi Mir's policy, and all of that criticism led to a few people being fired. Twardovsky objected to his associates being excluded from Novyi Mir's editorial board. Still, though, before he even received a reply, he resigned as editor-in-chief. In 1970, the entire country reads the first tale from Yury Trifonov's Moscow cycle called The Exchange, which was published in the final issue of Novyi Mir for 1969. Trifonov would go on to write one tale after another and complete the cycle. Taking Stock, The Long Goodbye, Another Life, The House on the Embankment. Village prose had been followed up by the urban variety. Trifonov saw his character in the hallway mirror, capturing each and every shade of gray. Dull characters with last names instead of first names, working at dreary research institutes and design bureaus. Science had long become a production force, intelligence a craft, and creativity a means of earning money. In the village, Mother Nature called the shots, while in the city, that honor went to the market, or rather the exchange. The amount of people living on exchange had gotten into the millions. Either newcomers had moved into town, or the younger generation had come of age. Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev bestows a gold star medal upon Tatar Zhivkov. The 2500-year anniversary of Samarkand, definitely and approximately, was celebrated. The Yury Mir Mausoleum and the Shah Izinda Ensemble were the hallmark of Soviet Middle Asia. Samarkand celebrated its glorious anniversary how you would an important national holiday. Known as Samarkand in ancient times, the capital of the Timurid Empire, and the first capital of Soviet Uzbekistan, Samarkand is recognized as the most ancient city in the entire USSR. During these anniversary days, an Ulugh-Beg memorial was opened. He was one of the great ancient scholars. At the general meeting of the Moscow Art Theater's troupe, the theater alternatively being known as the Gorky MKHAT, the USSR's Minister of Culture Furtsova presented a new chief director named Oleg Yefremov. The country's main drama theater had been having a tough time selling tickets for quite a while. The idea to breathe new life into the MKHAT was pitched by Moscow Art Theater veterans Tarasov, Gribov, Masalsky, and Yanshin. The theater was in need of a young, vibrant art director with experience in the field, who wouldn't turn out to be a complete stranger. Oleg Yefremov, an MKHAT studio graduate who considered his own Savremennik theater to be a sort of small MKHAT, turned out to be the most favorable and suitable candidate for the role. His first performance was Dulcinea del Toboso, where Yefremov played Don Quixote, quite cheerfully and elusively so. Appointing Yefremov to the MKHAT turned out to be one of the most significant decisions made by the USSR's most long-lived Minister of Culture, Ekaterina Alexeyevna Furtsova. By 1970, she had been in her position for a good 10 years. Furtsova was demoted to the Soviet Ministry of Culture after being a Central Committee secretary and a member of the Politburo. She wasn't on very familiar terms with her new line of work, but that said, Furtsova wholeheartedly fell in love with Soviet culture. Madam Minister looked quite young, she got her clothes from the best tailors. At times she proved to be ignorant and naive, at times she was liberal, and she was almost always sincere. Furtsova would often assume the role of a school principal, who could expel you or suspend you from class. She exuded power, often being referred to as Ekaterina the Great. 2 years, that's how long it took the country to prepare for the 100-year anniversary of Lenin's birth. The corresponding Central Committee decree was issued back in 1968. Celebrations turned out to be even more extravagant than festivities in honor of 50 years since the October Revolution. To honor the anniversary, a memorial complex was opened in Ulyanovsk, a huge division of the Central Lenin Museum, which engulfed the house where Lenin was born and spent the first 5 years of his life. The memorial zone also included the former Simbirsk Gymnasium, then known as Middle School No. 1, a new building belonging to the local pedagogical institute, along with a monument to Ulyanov Sr., the Venets Hotel, a memorial walk where they planted 100 lime trees, oaks, and maple trees, a statue of Maria Alexandrovna Ulyanova with little Vladimir, and finally the square of Lenin's 100-year anniversary. Located in the middle of the square was a swimming pool, the mosaic at the bottom of which earned sculptor Zurab Tsereteli his first ever high state award, namely a USSR state prize. However, the main memorial site was still the Simbirsk-Ulyanov house on Moskovskaya Street. This is where Lenin lived when he was a schoolboy, a fine example of the typical provincial Russian housing for the upper middle class. The house consisted of 10 rooms, 2 terraces, with an extension in the yard, as well as sheds for coaches, firewood. Here we have a court for playing croquet, which for the final quarter of the 19th century was a favorite pastime among kids, with a garden right next to that. Even given these details, it was hard to believe that a certain someone was born a century ago. The anniversary date appeared to be the end of an era. What with such a round number and massive festivities, this seemed to be the ultimate achievement, which simply couldn't be followed up by anything else. It felt as if Lenin would never reach his 101st birthday. Another memorial was opened in a settlement called Shushinskaya, in the Krasnoyarsk district, 15 acres next to a house belonging to a peasant named Zyryanov, where Lenin spent 14 months in exile. Among the memorial sites taken under protection were Peschanaya Gora, Zhuravlinaya Gorka, Sosnovy Bor, Berezovaya Roshya, and Lake Perovo. On April 21st, celebrations were concluded with a ceremonial meeting at the Palace of Congresses in the Kremlin, where Leonid Brezhnev gave a speech. Nikolai Podgorny opened the ceremony with the words, "The things that Lenin accomplished during his illustrious life are not a matter of 100 years, comrades, but rather they will live on for centuries and even millennia." Community work days were designated as Lenin days. That's when people would work on weekends without pay. In 1919, during the first such day, workers at the Moscow Sortirovichny depot repaired a steam locomotive. Their unpaid labor would be called the Great Initiative by Lenin. The anniversary breathes new life into that old activity. As soon as the day began, loudspeakers would start playing uplifting music. There were two basic outlines for spending community workdays, either at the workplace or doing landscaping, either exceeding the plan for producing goods or spring cleaning. At agencies, they'd wash the windows. Those days were somewhat similar to a picnic on the grass, with everybody showing up dressed as if ready to go camping, supplies all packed, and as soon as they were done with their modest chores, they'd enjoy a few drinks and some snacks. 1970 marked the beginning of West Germany's Eastern policy. Willy Brandt, who was the leader of the Social Democratic Party and the new federal chancellor, holds rather constructive negotiations with the neighbors, while spearheading the European de-escalation. Former governing mayor of West Berlin Willy Brandt knew better than any other Bonn politician that the East needed to be viewed through a new lens. Brandt holds meetings with East German Prime Minister Willy Stoph, which used to be something completely unthinkable, while offering a concept of special relations within the framework of a unified German nation. Brandt signs agreements with the USSR and Poland on the inviolability of post-war borders and on the refusal to resort to violent force. Disputes concerning the post-war map of Europe are resolved in favor of the existing status quo. Agreements with East Germany and Czechoslovakia would soon follow. Wigs come into fashion. The country witnesses a rapid increase in the number of blondes, and brown-haired women to a somewhat lesser extent. Naturally, wigs came to us from abroad, with sailors being the first to bring them in. Now you could remove your hairdo before bed, easily wash it and dry it out on top of a 3-liter jar. Women no longer had to wear hats during the winter. Generally speaking, hair salons in the USSR weren't really that great. You always had to know somebody, make an appointment in advance. Always a hassle and a somewhat nerve-wracking experience. There couldn't have been a better time for wigs to come into fashion. Women could put them on in the morning, get everything sorted and looking right, and look just completely irresistible. Speculators would bring in huge shipments of wigs. Later they appeared in stores, albeit they were quite expensive. In the 1970s, wigs were basically a pre-made haircut for most middle-class, city-dwelling women of the time. To commemorate 25 years since winning the war, the first 2 parts of the Liberation film saga were released. Director Yuri Ozerov collaborated with writers Yuri Bondarev and Oskar Kurganov to create a moving diorama which included 2 military commands, hundreds of tanks, auxiliary troops representing 5 nations, complemented by complex pyrotechnics and historical makeup. Liberation first introduced military operations maps with moving arrows and panoramic aerial shots of tank battles. Critics have yet to dub this a war from a bird's eye view. For the first time since de-Stalinization, Stalin is featured in a movie. What does Zhukov have to say? As for Zhukov, this was his first portrayal in a feature film, period. From there on out, he would always be played by Mikhail Ulyanov. with Hitler consistently being portrayed in Soviet cinema by Fritz Dietz from East Germany. The movie featured 50 real-life historic figures, with varying degrees of portrait similarity. Subtitles, which included last name and rank, were provided to prevent any confusion. Just as you'd expect given the anniversary, the visualization of the war was stunning and stately. Armor-piercing round, fire! The private storyline was mostly focused on Nikolai Alyalin, who played Battalion Commander Tsvetaev. Those vagabonds! Stop or I'll be the first to shoot you! With a total of 50 million viewers, the first two parts of the Liberation Saga become the most popular films of 1971. In 1970, production begins of the Smena 8M photo camera, the main device used by amateur photographers, which our country had millions of. The numbers indicating exposure and focus were complemented by the corresponding symbols. The sun in the clouds, a group photo portrait. This was the new budget-class gold standard, with the most popular models selling for 15 rubles. Up to 1 million Smena 8Ms were produced every year. A hierarchy came about. On the other end of the Soviet amateur camera spectrum, there was the semi-professional Zenit E. It was a bit cheaper with an Industar lens and slightly more expensive when equipped with one from Helios. Back then, Nikita Sergeyevich was first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Ukraine. During the international Tchaikovsky competition, they would often highlight the fact that it wasn't individual talents competing, but instead national schools. The fourth Tchaikovsky competition, held in 1970, simultaneously showcased pretty much the entire new generation of Soviet performers. The list of Soviet victors is as follows. First prize for playing the cello was awarded to David Geringas. First prize among piano players went to Vladimir Krainev. Gidon Kramer was the best violin player, with Vladimir Spivakov following in second and Liana Isakadze in third. As for the singers, first place went to Yelena Obraztsova, Tamara Sinyavskaya, Nikolai Ohrenich, Yevgeny Nesterenko, Zurab Sutkilavo was second. In no more than a couple of years, this generation of performers would become the core of the national music scene. Under the guise of "Your victory is a victory for sports," in 1970, the earliest editions of the sport lotto were issued. This sort of lottery was something completely new to the country. Out of 49 sporting disciplines, you had to choose 6 and correctly guess at least 3 of them. Whoever guessed all 6 received 10,000 rubles, which back then was the biggest prize in all of the USSR. As for the main innovation which ensured the success of the sport lotto, whoever bought the ticket crossed out the squares with their own hand, thereby forging their own luck. Now citizens who believed in lucky breaks no longer had to rely on getting tickets with the right serial number at the nearest savings bank. Soon people would start analyzing statistics, determining the odds of water polo having an advantage during the second lottery in May. Soon Sport Lotto 2 would come about, where you had to guess 5 out of 36. The Luna 17 station transports the Lunokhod 1 rover to the moon. The word itself was formed in a fashion reminiscent of the first post-revolutionary years. They'd also call it the lunar tractor. The Lunokhod 1 examines the various properties of the moon's surface, while relaying its discoveries back to Earth. This is what our lunar program looked like. We suggested that stationing equipment on the moon long-term was way more useful than sending a few astronauts who'd leave after a couple of hours. The plan was for Lunokhod to operate on the moon for 3 months, but as a matter of fact, that turned into 10.5 months. It explored a territory of roughly 31,000 square miles, and later lived on as an image on postal stamps, toys, souvenirs, as a nickname for law enforcement patrol cars, and a name for all-terrain shoes. This year, when we celebrate Lenin's anniversary, and when we're preparing for the 24th Congress of the Communist Party, our scientists, designers, engineers, technicians, and workers have successfully implemented a new and spectacular experiment. A movie by Vladimir Model called White Son of the Desert becomes the best Civil War-themed Eastern, the most brilliant way to vindicate White Army officers, while providing common folk with a record amount of phrases that they could quote. What else do I want to tell you? Our relocation is going smoothly, in an environment of brotherhood and harmony. We're just walking over the sand without any complaints. But I do miss you. My one and only Katerina Matveyevna. How the hell did you wind up here? I was being shot at. What's wrong with you? It's from Comrade Sukhov. Go ahead and read it. Hey, show me your face. Don't worry, I'm not gonna hurt you. I'm all about serious intentions. Peacocks, you say? A good wife, a nice house. What else can a guy ask for when he gets old? The yeast is a delicate matter. Aristarch, you go ahead and negotiate with customs.
Благородие, госпожа, удача. Для кого ты добрая, а кому иначе.
After that song by Isaac Schwartz, based on poetry by Bulat Akujava, the very concept of nobility became associated solely with Tsarist officers. St. George Cavalier Vereshchagin delivers the movie's most important quote. I don't take bribes. I feel pain for my country. At the same time, a TV series comes out called The Adjutant of His Excellency, which showcased how the White Army Command abided to the officer's code of honor. Pavel Andreevich? Yes? Are you a spy? The anthem to shoulder belts that was The Adjutant of His Excellency received a USSR state prize. Each and every deceased migrant was exonerated. A monograph dedicated to chess champion Alexander Alyokhin is released. During the late 60s and early 70s, a 9-volume anthology of Ivan Bunin's works is published. Only blatantly anti-Soviet pieces weren't included, such as Cursed Days. Urban folklore fills that gap with a song about Lieutenant Golitsyn and Cornet Obolensky. Our rooms are occupied by commissioners who are leading our ladies into the office. The White Army opposition becomes a fashion trend, and now the word Russia could be used without adding the adjective Soviet, with a lump in your throat and tears in your eyes, and the urge to stand up before downing your drink. Joining the white resistance and subsequently migrating instead of being treason was now officially considered to be a tragic mistake. Those who were previously seen to be weed grass pulled from the root by the blistered hand of the proletarian revolution became thin spikelets when the 70s rolled around. In the movie The New Adventures of the Elusive Avengers, it was a white officer who sang the main song dedicated to the motherland, with music by Jan Frenkel and lyrics by Inna Goff. It was titled Russian Field.
Здесь отчизна моя, и скажу не тая, здравствуй, русское поле, я твой тонкий колосок.
While the hunters were loading their rifles, gardening associations, mostly thanks to department industry regulation, were approved in the form of 1.5 acres of land and what's basically a doghouse built on top of it. 600 square meters wasn't what you'd call a country house. A large territory with a big house, this was something typically granted to important people. That's a luxury even in today's world. 600 square meters, that was a mini country house, usually located in the nearest suburb. At first, there were gardens where you couldn't legally build any structures. Afterwards, they'd allow shacks for storing equipment, and later even tiny houses with no heating. Inexperienced folk, upon receiving their 600 meters, utilize 500 of them to imitate farming, while dedicating the rest to major construction. And in both cases, they'd outdo the professionals residing in the nearest collective or state farm. Valuable experience was quickly passed on from person to person, and meanwhile a progressive initiative swept the nation. The point was to sow carrots right next to an apple tree, in the name of efficient use of space. Villagers would typically do their supplementary farming in the usual lazy village manner, planting potatoes and a few sorts of vegetables. City dwellers would indulge in fruit, berries, and juices. They'd promote crops that were thought to be impossible to cultivate so far north. Given a lack of black soil, the land began to bear cherries, plums, cherry plums. Everybody had their own greenhouses, and from that moment, once springtime rolled around, millions of urbanites would place saplings onto their windowsills. Cherry tomatoes were considered to be the most valuable. They were nice, round, and about this tiny. Summer residents would proudly encourage counting the vitamins, since their own harvest would feed them year-round. For a while, there were certain restrictions in place limiting the size of houses. In some cases, it was 172, in others 269 square feet. There was also a height limit. For example, second floors were prohibited, leading dacha owners to build spacious attics. The amount of fruit-bearing trees was also limited. They had rules on how to develop one's land, as in where you can build your house, your shed, where to plant the bushes. For many years, only villagers were allowed to have land plots. This wasn't how Lenin intended it to be. This was sort of a concession to the proprietary nature of a villager, or a peasant, if you will. This was the Soviet government's way of admitting that collective farms weren't even capable of feeding the collective farmers themselves. And from the moment they allowed urbanites to own their 600 square meters, they effectively admitted that collective farms weren't able to provide city residents with enough food. People literally threw themselves at their 600 square meters. Lids for jars all of a sudden became a rare commodity. You know, for the type of jars you'd preserve your fruits and vegetables in. Upon seeing these new kulaks, the hardcore communists would literally feel heartbroken. These red folks understood full well that this was a seemingly minor, but in fact a severe blow to socialism in and of itself. And this indeed proved to be true. After a hard day at work, once the work week came to an end, people would make their way not just to the countryside. They'd move from socialism to capitalism in a sense. This was something that plenty of people were well aware of. What used to be the Radio and Television Broadcasting Committee under the Council of Ministers became the Council of Ministers State Committee overseeing television and radio broadcasting. The entire point was to elevate television's status above radio. The nation was quickly heading for a point where for every 100 families there were 100 TV sets. Given a lack of any sort of entertainment industry, poorly developed communications, and foreign travel being unavailable to most people, television or a newspaper in pictures becomes a church, a club, a concert hall, and the main window through which to see the world. Metal stampings become the latest generic item for room decoration. Georgian and Baltic metal art workers would treat copper, brass, aluminum, and roofing iron. Finished items would be heated with a blowtorch to get a sort of antique tint going. Very soon, pockmarked plates depicting women, old men, and children would be all over the place. Voluptuous women would symbolize beauty, old men would have iconographic facial features, while children, which were Latvia's specialty, would mark restrooms, wherever they were separate, with the girls bathing and boys urinating. Soon metal stampings would find their way beyond private apartments and into public facilities. Brownish metal would adorn ministries, restaurants, subway stations, and hotels. In 1970, the Nobel Prize in Literature was awarded to Alexander Solzhenitsyn. By that time, the Lenin Prize applicant of not too long ago ceased to be published in the USSR. Meanwhile, in the West, Cancer Ward, In the First Circle, and The Feast of Victors are published, while the Gulag Archipelago has yet to be released. Solzhenitsyn was promptly ousted from the Writers' Union. The Soviet press describes him receiving the Nobel Prize as a provocative political act. But you must never be too zealous when criticizing, since no more than 5 years prior, the Nobel Prize was properly awarded to Sholokhov. Solzhenitsyn decides to do whatever it takes to make it to Stockholm. The government does nothing to prevent him leaving the country, but they made it very clear that there was no way back. Solzhenitsyn cancels his trip, and the incriminating speech he sent over was read at the gala dinner with a few revisions. However, the leaders of two superpowers agreed on the need for initiating a dialogue. October 15, 1970 was the day when the most high-profile plane hijacking occurred in the entire history of Soviet commercial aviation. During a flight from Sukhumi to Batumi, Pranas Brzezinskas and his son drew guns on the flight crew and demanded they land the An-24 airplane in Turkey. In the ensuing gunfight, the captain of the vessel was injured, together with the co-pilot and the flight mechanic. 19-year-old flight attendant Nadezhda Korchenko was killed. The plane finally did land on Turkish territory. After the incident, all Soviet domestic airports were equipped with metal detectors. Brzezinska's father and Brzezinska's son spent a bit of time in a Turkish prison and then migrated to the United States. For a while, the USSR demanded they be extradited, but it never happened. Nadezhda Korchenko was posthumously awarded an Order of the Red Banner. A new TV show comes out called Come On Girls. It proves that humankind's better half was not weak, but rather strong. At its core, this show was about propagating trades. Telegraphers, phone operators, adjusters, and coilers all competed for the title Best in the Trade. Right now, Tanya Pavlenko will showcase her first competitive dancing act. That's the song of a turtle dove. You hesitated, but you're correct. That was indeed a turtle dove. You get 2 points. Girls also had to be pretty, smart, or at the very least educated, have good taste in clothing, be a good cook, and able to do some sort of old-fashioned dance. This was the precursor to beauty pageants. Come On Girls finalists received letters from suitors from all over the country. Something to keep the trendies busy. How to source a thin and somewhat skin-tight sweater with a tubular collar that you can fold in half. The item in question received the name turtleneck, based on its appearance. For men, turtlenecks, which weren't compatible with wearing a tie, became a sort of liberating substitute for a collared shirt. Turtlenecks sat well on both men and women alike. Colors ranged from white to black. Basically, all of the imported ones were 100% synthetic. Otherwise, they would stretch out way too quickly. These were pretty difficult to obtain, with turtlenecks being worn by artists and writers, trade workers, and in international relations departments. In keeping with the trend, Russian-made turtlenecks appear. However, the sleeves looked like men's underwear at the edges. In 1970, for the first and final time, the Lenin Prize was awarded to a singer whose repertoire didn't consist of classic songs. Lyudmila Zykina finally becomes famous at a rather mature age. She began by energetically performing prosaic songs, but as the years went by, Zykina grew more majestic, stately, and switched to singing music with more panache. You're about to see a film shot near Samara with her wearing her everyday dress, singing a masterpiece by Fratkin and Oshanin called The Volga Flows On.
Течет река Волга, течет река Волга, конца и края среди хлебов спелых, среди снегов белых течет моя Волга, а мне 17 лет, а мне 17 лет.
The Gorky automobile plant begins production of a new Volga. The Gaz-24 replaced the previous generation Gaz-21. Volga was both the main river and the most renowned car. This was Russia's only mid-sized automobile, with the highest level of comfort among anything you could theoretically get your hands on. The new 24 had a top speed of about 90 miles per hour. The exterior styling was quite striking and eye-catching, with it bearing a distinctly Western flavor. The Volga was an executive sedan, with management types typically preferring black Volgas. Volgas were also used as taxis, ambulances, but for the common car enthusiast, they were an unattainable dream ride. These weren't available on the open market, and you needed to get a special permit to buy one. The typical private owner of a Volga was either someone who used to work abroad, or a wealthy Caucasian man. And that was 1970, episode 10 of our series the other day, 1961 to 1991, current era. Next time we're going to be covering 1971, self-serve stores, Angela Davis, Ladas becoming mass-market cars, the beginning of Jewish migration to Israel, Cola Beldi, the first available French perfumes, and student construction brigades. See you for a new episode and a new year. Farewell.